On October 15th of 1858, Alton, Illinois hosted the seventh and final Lincoln-Douglas debate.
The debates took place in front of City Hall, which used to be kind of back here.
That's SIU Edwardsville history professor Eric Alexander.
And so the crowds would have been around here, and yeah.
And a big crowd.
Anywhere from 6,000 to 10,000 people.
Wow. All 7 debates drew huge crowds. In St. Louis, a steamboat advertised a round trip to Alton that day, for it said all those desirous to hear those 2 champions in the politics of Illinois. There's a lot of contrast here. So Stephen Douglas is known as the little giant.
Right.
He was not a tall man.
Lincoln's about a foot taller. Douglas is maybe 5'4", 5'5".
Yeah.
And Lincoln is, 6'4", 6'5", in that range.
And a contrast of styles in terms of personalities.
Right. Though I think, ironically, at the time of the debates, it was Douglas who was arguably the most famous political figure in the United States. And then you had Lincoln, who outside of Illinois was not particularly well known.
Now, this was not the kind of candidate debates we're used to, the back and forth, questions, answers, rebuttals. In these debates, the first candidate, and who went first, switched from city to city, would speak for 1 hour. The next candidate spoke for an hour and a half, and then the first candidate would get a half hour to wrap things up. And with thousands of people, you wonder how many in this crowd heard any of it. But then many perhaps simply came to see as much as to hear.
Again, it's the 19th century, so this was entertainment. This kind of debate didn't really happen that often, so it was unique. And then the fact that they're arguing about what were the most important issues of the day.
The issue, of course, was slavery, or rather, the expansion of slavery into new states. Douglas, the Democrat, favored letting voters in each state decide the issue. Lincoln, a member of the newly formed Republican Party, was opposed to having any more slave states. And while this was just one Senate race, it was a national story. And because of new technologies and innovations, the news was spreading fast. At every debate, newspapermen used shorthand to transcribe what they were hearing. They handed their notes to be taken by train to Chicago. They were translated along the way into the written word, and upon arrival, set in type for the newspaper and telegraphed to papers in eastern cities. So this is like a media event.
Yes, it is.
Right?
Absolutely.
I don't know if we can say there was any media event quite like this before.
I don't think so. You really are seeing people figure out how to use the media, even manipulate the media. So one of the interesting things about these debates is that, as famous as they are, Lincoln and Douglas didn't actually say a lot that was new. They were kind of repeating the standard stump speeches for their party. But what was new is that they knew they were talking to a larger audience. So Lincoln realized, I'm not just talking to fellow Republicans in Alton or fellow Republicans in Illinois. I'm talking to Republicans in Michigan and Wisconsin and New York and the Northeast. And that helped bring his name, make him a household name that he had not been before.
Lincoln is not an abolitionist.
Right.
But he's also being charged with maybe being too pro-African American.
Right. Douglas routinely accused Lincoln of being, as you said, an abolitionist, of being a radical who was in favor of racial equality. Lincoln knew that the audiences he was playing to were not in favor of those ideas. One thing I think it's hard for my students to understand, and I think hard for Americans in the 21st century to understand, it was possible to be simultaneously anti-slavery, believe that slavery was morally wrong, but also to be anti-black, to not believe in racial equality. So he's making this distinction. I believe slavery is wrong. I believe people should be entitled to earn what they work for, but that doesn't mean I believe in equality. And so that was one of the constant back and forth of these debates.
U.S. senators at the time were elected by state legislatures, not by popular vote, and Douglas was reelected to the Senate. But Lincoln was now a national figure. He went on a speaking tour, distributed copies of the debates. And in 1860, he ran for president, defeating, among others, Stephen A. Douglas. And we know what happened after that. Events that were being set in motion in the country and in Alton, Illinois, 166 years ago, this week in St. Louis history. For Living St. Louis, I'm Jim Kircher.